The hum of machines, a sound once so familiar, now echoed through the cramped corridors of Skytopia like a distant, mournful reminder. It was the only constant in a place where everything else seemed to be unraveling. For a brief moment, Elias Fisk, the brilliant and eccentric inventor who had built this floating city, stood at the edge of the observation deck, looking down at the earth below. Or rather, what was left of it. The surface, scorched and scarred by years of climate catastrophe, was barely recognizable anymore. But Skytopia, this metal, floating sanctuary above the ruins, was supposed to be the answer. A soft beep from the terminal behind him broke his reverie. Elias turned, his white lab coat fluttering like a flag caught in a breeze. His fingers, long and slightly trembling, swiped across the panel, bringing up the latest readings. The trajectory of Skytopia was off. Again, damn it, Elias muttered under his breath, his voice cracking slightly. He wasn't used to losing his cool, but this was something else. A floating city, once so meticulously engineered to escape Earth's dying embrace, was now careening toward the void. Skytopia, he whispered, as if the city could hear him and somehow make things right again. What happened to you? There was a knock on the doorframe behind him. Elias turned to see Mara, his second in command, standing with a clipboard in hand. She was dressed in her usual utilitarian jumpsuit, her face lined with worry that no amount of makeup could cover. Elias, she said, her voice clipped. We need to talk. I know, Elias said, nodding slowly. The city's drifting. No, Mara replied, stepping forward. The city's falling. The disaster had started months ago, though Elias refused to acknowledge it at first. In the beginning, when they'd first launched Skytopia into the upper atmosphere, everything had seemed perfect. A new ark for humanity, floating safely above the Earth's ravaged surface. It was the ultimate solution, except it wasn't. The city was built with the best of intentions, but somewhere along the way, things had gone awry. Elias had designed Skytopia to hover just above the Earth's atmosphere. In theory, the city would be an orbiting sanctuary, immune to the storms, earthquakes, and famine devastating the planet below. The engineering was based on sound science, or so it seemed at the time. The problem, as it turned out, was that no one had factored in the shift in the Earth's magnetic fields, the changes in gravity, and the rapid degradation of the city's propulsion systems. What was supposed to be a stable orbit quickly became a slow drift away from Earth, and now, here they were. Elias, Mara said again, her voice growing firmer. You need to tell the others. He shook his head, the weight of the situation finally settling on his shoulders. He wasn't ready to admit it to the people who had placed their trust in him. They'd all come to Skytopia hoping for salvation, for hope, for a fresh start. What could he possibly tell them now? Tell them what? Elias asked, his voice a mix of exasperation and disbelief. That we're doomed? That the city's falling into space? That we're all going to die alone, out here, in the void? We won't die, Mara said, her gaze unwavering. But if you don't act fast, that's what's going to happen. Skytopia's losing altitude. The propulsion systems are failing. We're drifting farther away from Earth every day. And if we don't do something now, we're going to end up in deep space. Elias slumped into the chair by the console, burying his face in his hands. He had designed every aspect of this city with the utmost precision. Every calculation, every diagram, every system had been meticulously crafted to avoid the very catastrophe that was now unfolding. But now it seemed all for nothing. Mara stood there, her arms crossed, waiting for him to gather himself. Elias exhaled slowly, lifting his head to meet her gaze. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the failure. We need to bring the city back, Elias said quietly, almost to himself. But I don't know how. Mara didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned and walked to the console, where she began typing furiously, pulling up diagnostics, tracking the city's movements. Elias watched as her fingers danced across the keys, trying to make sense of the data, trying to find a solution. "We have limited fuel," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "If we can't stabilize our orbit, we'll be stranded. There's no way we're making it back to Earth on this trajectory. We'll end up somewhere, but not home." "Somewhere," Elias echoed, his mind spinning. "What if?" He trailed off, and Mara turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. "What if we didn't go back?" Elias asked. "What if we used what we have left to break free of Earth's pull entirely?" "Break free?" Mara asked, her tone skeptical. "Are you out of your mind? We're not a spaceship, Elias. We're a city. We don't have the resources for interstellar travel." "I'm not talking about interstellar travel," Elias replied, his voice gaining confidence. "I'm talking about using the moon's gravity to slingshot us back onto a more stable orbit. We don't need to go home, we just need to stabilize ourselves, to survive." Mara's face softened, but she still looked doubtful. "And if it doesn't work?" Elias smiled grimly, pushing his chair back. "Then we'll have to improvise. It's what we do best." In the control room, the atmosphere was tense as Elias and Mara convened with the engineering team. The air was thick with uncertainty and fear. Some of the faces were familiar, scientists who had been with Elias from the beginning, back when the dream of Skytopia had still felt like a miracle. Others were newer residents, people who had come to the city in the hope of escaping the chaos below, now staring at their uncertain futures with a mix of dread and confusion. "We're running out of time," Elias said, addressing the room. His voice was firm, even though his stomach churned with anxiety. "I know this isn't what you expected when you signed up for Skytopia, but right now, we're the only ones who can fix this. If we don't act, the city will continue drifting into space. I can't promise we'll make it back to Earth, but I can promise you this: we won't give up without a fight." There was a moment of silence as the residents exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of the engineers, a woman named Sarah, stood up and raised her hand. "I think we can do it," she said. "But we'll need to work together. If we pull the remaining fuel and use the city's thrusters to aim for the moon, we can do a slingshot maneuver. It's going to be dangerous, and there's a high risk that we'll miss our mark. But it's our best shot." The room was quiet as everyone processed her words. Elias could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them all. But in that moment, there was no other choice. He nodded solemnly, his voice resolute. "Then let's get to work." Over the next few hours, the crew worked tirelessly, prepping the city's systems for the daring maneuver. Elias and Mara oversaw the operation, their minds sharp and focused, but the reality of their situation still loomed over them like a shadow. The fuel was low, and the risk of failure was enormous. The thrusters would have to be aligned perfectly, the calculations precise, or they would be lost. As the countdown began, Elias couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had overlooked something crucial. But it was too late to back out now. 5 seconds, Mara called, her voice calm but urgent. 4, 3, 2, 1, the engines fired, and Skytopia lurched violently. The city groaned, the sounds of metal creaking echoing through the halls as it slowly adjusted its course. Elias watched the readouts on the console, his heart racing as they neared the moon. The thrusters sputtered, their firelight briefly illuminating the observation deck like a sunrise that might never fade. The tremor that rippled through Skytopia was something Elias had expected, but it still rattled his bones. The entire city had just adjusted its course, a delicate, risky maneuver that could either bring them closer to the moon or send them careening into the abyss. Elias stood with his hands gripping the edges of the control panel, eyes fixed on the diagnostics. Numbers flashed rapidly, giving him a heartbeat's worth of hope before they shifted, dancing like flickering shadows. They weren't exactly on the moon's orbit yet, but the city had stopped its immediate drift into the unknown. Skytopia wasn't falling into space, at least, not yet. The rest of the room was still, too still, as the crew monitored the results of the slingshot attempt. Every face was bathed in the sickly glow of the monitors, eyes darting across them as if expecting something, anything, to change. The silence stretched, and in that moment, Elias could almost believe that the city was alive, holding its breath like the people within it. Mara was the first to break it. "Did we make it?" she asked quietly, her voice as steady as the ground they no longer stood on. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the screen flicker with a new set of data. The trajectory was adjusting, but it wasn't as smooth as it should have been. They had missed their mark, but only slightly. They were now in an unstable orbit around the moon. Not exactly the direct route they'd hoped for, but at least they weren't plummeting into the cold expanse of deep space. For now, they were on the moon's gravitational cusp, lingering between the Earth and the lunar surface, waiting. "We're not dead yet," Elias said, finally allowing a breath to escape his lips. He didn't have a better answer. Not yet. The next few hours were filled with the hum of machines, the sound of engineers hustling to recalibrate their systems. Elias couldn't help but feel the pressure weighing down on him. They had survived the initial maneuver, but that was only the first hurdle. The real question now was whether they could stabilize their orbit and eventually get back to Earth, or if that was even possible anymore. He had always been a man of action, a creator, a problem solver. But right now, the weight of the unknown seemed to press on his chest in a way that made him wish he could just disappear into the machines, let them take over for once. But no. He was the one who had designed this city. The success of Skytopia rested on his shoulders, and if it was going to fall, then he would be there at the very end. Mara had vanished into the backrooms with the engineers, leaving Elias alone in the observation deck. His fingers tapped a rhythmic beat against the cold metal of the console, his gaze fixed on the Earth below. Once, that blue and green marble had been his whole world. But now, it seemed a lifetime away. There was nothing left for them down there, not in the physical sense, anyway. Skytopia was home, for better or worse. They would have to make it work. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft beep from the console. A new set of readings had appeared, calculations that suggested something that made Elias freeze. The trajectory wasn't simply an accident. The slingshot had done something to their momentum that was both unexpected and, in some ways, brilliant. They weren't heading toward the moon in a simple arc. They were gaining speed. He quickly brought up more data, swiping through the screens, each one more baffling than the last. If they maintained this trajectory, they wouldn't just be orbiting the moon, they might actually be able to break free of the Earth's gravitational pull entirely. And that, Elias knew, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Elias, come here." Mara's voice cut through the tension like a knife, pulling him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her face tight with concern but with something else in her eyes. Something that Elias couldn't quite place. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Look," she said, motioning for him to follow her into the command room. "The slingshot worked." "Kind of. But we've got another problem." Elias followed her to the console where the other engineers were gathered, their faces grim as they studied the new data. "It was worse than he'd thought." "I thought you said we'd be able to stabilize," Mara said, her voice low. "We can, but the city's core systems are more fragile than we anticipated," Sarah, the lead engineer, replied, her hands hovering over the touchscreen. "We're operating at the edge of what's possible. The fuel reserves won't last long enough to get us back to Earth. We can't keep slingshotting through space like this. Eventually, we'll run out of options." Elias closed his eyes, his mind racing through the possibilities. What had he missed? The calculations were solid. The trajectory, even with the slingshot's erratic nature, should have worked. They should have had more time, more room to breathe. But everything was accelerating, and not in the way they had hoped. He could feel the weight of it all, his failure, the lives depending on him, the city that he had once thought of as a marvel. And now, it was teetering on the edge of collapse. They couldn't keep going in circles. They had to make a decision. "What are our options?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Mara and Sarah exchanged a glance before Mara spoke again. There's a theory. A long shot, but if we can use what's left of the fuel to create a controlled burn and angle the city back toward Earth, but we're too far. Elias interjected, his hands clenched into fists. We're too far from Earth to just steer back. We'd burn out before we even came close. Not if we use the moon's gravity, Sarah said, her voice quiet but sure. We can slingshot again. This time, for real. But we'd have to time it perfectly. Elias looked at her, the gears in his brain turning. If they calculated the right angle and speed, they could use the moon's gravity to catapult themselves back toward Earth. If they timed it right, I need a crew, Elias said. We're going to make this happen. Hours passed, and the team worked tirelessly, recalibrating the engines, tweaking the trajectory, and running simulations. The crew, despite their fear and exhaustion, had rallied behind Elias. There was no more talk of failure, no more arguing. They were in this together, and they would fight for Skytopia, for their survival. As the final countdown began, Elias stood at the helm of the command center, his fingers hovering over the control panel. The moon loomed large in the viewport, a pale giant hanging in the vastness of space. This was it. The moment of truth. 5 seconds, Mara called. Elias nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. 4 years ago, he had designed this city as the pinnacle of human achievement. And now, here he was, fighting with every ounce of his being to save it. 4, 3, 2, the engines roared to life again, and this time, the thrust was more controlled, more powerful. Elias could feel the force pushing the city forward, pushing it back toward Earth. The moon's gravity pulled at them, guiding them as they accelerated, the vast emptiness of space their only companion. The data streamed across the console, telling Elias everything he needed to know. We're on track, Mara said, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. It's working. Elias couldn't speak. He just nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as the city's path began to curve, toward Earth. Toward home. It took hours, but when the data finally confirmed it, when the city's course was set and the systems were stable, Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe. Skytopia was back on its path. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. But as Elias stood in the control room, looking out at the Earth below, a strange feeling washed over him. The world they had left behind was no longer the same. No matter what happened next, life would never be what it had once been. But there was something else, something deeper, that Elias could feel in the pit of his stomach. They had made it. And for the first time in a long time, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a future, and it was going to be their future. The next few days were a blur of activity. Elias had expected to feel relief once the course was set, but instead, a new weight pressed on him. With their trajectory finally stabilized, they weren't just waiting anymore, they were moving forward. Toward Earth. Toward the unknown. The engines, though functional, were still operating at their limits, and the city's fragile systems hummed along, fragile as glass. Every piece of Skytopia, from the small control panels to the massive turbines, seemed to carry the same quiet, unspoken question: for how long? Elias had spent the better part of the last few days in the command center, working tirelessly alongside Mara, Sarah, and the rest of the crew. They recalibrated systems, checked the fuel levels, and recalculated every trajectory adjustment. The numbers were never exact, but they were close enough. Every time they ran a simulation, they came a little closer to reality, an orbit where they could eventually re-enter Earth's atmosphere safely, without burning up or crashing. Skytopia's fragile orbit around the moon had been a blessing and a curse. It had bought them time, but it had also made them realize how much more they needed to do to make their survival sustainable. They'd had no idea how thin the line between success and failure truly was until they were on the edge of space, but even in the chaos, there was something to be thankful for. They weren't dead. Not yet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the crew seemed to have found a sense of purpose. People worked together without the weight of uncertainty crushing them. It was almost like a second chance, though no one dared to call it that aloud. Elias didn't sleep much during those first few days. The constant hum of the engines was a lullaby of sorts, steady and unyielding. But his mind couldn't rest. He couldn't stop thinking about the city, about Earth, about the people they'd left behind. The world he had once thought of as broken had been replaced with something worse. Skytopia was now a symbol of human ingenuity, and of human failure. Mara had been the one to find him one evening, sitting by the observation deck once more, staring out into the void. Her footsteps echoed behind him, soft but purposeful. He didn't look up. He knew it was her without needing to see. "You should take a break," Mara said, her voice almost too quiet. She stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the vastness of space. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Elias shook his head. "I can't stop. Not yet." "There's nothing more you can do right now," Mara replied gently. "The course is set. You've done everything you can. I just keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong. All the things I missed, you know. I built this city. I thought I could control everything. But out here, there's so much we can't control. I've failed these people, Mara. I can feel it." Mara watched him for a long moment, then sighed. "You didn't fail them. You brought them here. You gave them hope when there was none. Don't forget that. No one else could have done what you did." Elias didn't answer. Instead, he turned to look at the stars beyond the glass, the twinkling lights like ancient beacons in the vast emptiness. It was almost comforting, knowing that the universe had been here long before humanity had ever set foot on this broken world, and it would be here long after they were gone, too. The days blended into nights as they steadily drew closer to Earth. There was no celebrating, no fanfare. The work continued, with each member of the crew pushing themselves harder, checking and double-checking every system. Skytopia was a living, breathing thing, and for the first time since its creation, Elias was beginning to feel like it was truly his city. It was his responsibility. He would do whatever it took to get them back. The moon, once a distant object on the horizon, now loomed large in the viewport as Skytopia's orbit gradually shrank, pulling them closer to Earth. The blue planet below beckoned, like a distant dream, beautiful, terrifying, and somehow beyond reach. Each day, they inched closer, each calculation more precise than the last. The crew became quieter as the tension mounted, as if everyone understood that they were on the edge of something huge. But no one spoke of it. No one said the word return. It wasn't certain. Not yet. Mara stood by Elias as the final stages of the journey approached. The engines were beginning to show signs of wear, and the fuel reserves were running low. He could see the worry in her eyes, but she never let it slip through. The others felt it too, quiet unease that filled every corridor, every room, and even the air they breathed. There was nothing to do now but wait and hope. One morning, several weeks after their slingshot attempt, Skytopia's main console beeped with a signal that made Elias's heart race. He rushed to the console, his eyes scanning the screen, trying to make sense of the data. "It's Earth," he muttered under his breath, his fingers moving quickly across the keys. The signal was faint, but it was unmistakable. Earth's atmosphere was visible now, far below, but within range. "We're close," Elias said, standing up abruptly. "We're almost there." Mara joined him at the console, her eyes scanning the data. "This is it, then. We're about to re-enter." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight with anticipation. They weren't home yet. They still had to survive the re-entry, the hardest part. The thought of the city's fragile frame burning up in the atmosphere sent a shiver down his spine. They had to do it perfectly, or they wouldn't do it at all. "We're ready," Elias said, though his voice felt hollow even to him. "It's now or never." Mara gave him a long, searching look. "You've done everything, Elias. No matter what happens, you've given them a chance. Don't forget that." Elias nodded, but the fear gnawed at him. He couldn't let go of the idea that something, anything, could go wrong. Underscore 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 underscore. The final countdown began, and Skytopia's systems hummed as they prepared to descend. The engines, now running on fumes, roared as the city tilted toward Earth, the gravitational pull growing stronger with each passing second. The crew had done everything they could. It was all down to the precision of their trajectory, the angle of descent, and the fragility of the city itself. Time seemed to stretch as the city's descent began. The air inside the city shifted, the pressure building slightly as they entered the outer layer of the atmosphere. Elias gripped the console, his eyes focused on the readouts. The monitors were blinking red, warning of unstable conditions. Every minute felt like an eternity. Every passing second threatened to undo all of their hard work. "We're going too fast," Sarah said, her voice rising with panic. "We need to slow down." But it was too late. The city had entered the thickest layers of the atmosphere, and the sudden pressure threw the systems into chaos. Elias slammed his hand down on the emergency override, but the console wasn't responding. His heart pounded as the outside air grew more turbulent, the sound of metal screaming against the friction of the atmosphere rattling his bones. Then, all at once, the shaking stopped. A sudden, eerie calm settled over Skytopia as the control systems stabilized. Elias looked at the screen again, his pulse racing. "We did it," Mara whispered. Elias couldn't speak. The city had made it through, they were home. The earth below was no longer the broken world they had left behind. It was healing. Slowly, but it was healing. Skytopia, battered but intact, drifted over the landscape, the city that had once been a symbol of escape now a beacon of hope. Elias didn't know what came next. He didn't know if they could ever fully return to life as it had been. But for now, he didn't need to. They had survived, and that, for Elias Fisk, was enough.